The air in the Sabura district was thick with the mingled scents of spiced wine, roasting meat, and human sweat. Lanterns swung from crooked doorways, casting pools of flickering light onto the cracked cobblestones, where drunken soldiers staggered arm in arm with women whose painted smiles never reached their eyes. From open windows came the muffled sounds of laughter, moans, and the sharp clatter of dice cups striking worn wooden tables. This was Rome's underbelly, its pulse beating far from the marble grandeur of the Forum, where anonymity was currency, and sin was the city's most reliable trade. I walked alone, my senator's cloak drawn tight, its hood casting a shadow over my face. This was not a place for men of my station to be seen, yet curiosity and a private errand had drawn me here. The narrow alleyways seemed to close in as I moved deeper into the district, their damp stone walls alive with whispers in tongues both Roman and foreign. The Sabura did not care about titles or bloodlines. Here, a patrician was worth no more than the coin in his hand. Ahead, a crude wooden sign, painted with a crimson phallus, swung gently in the night breeze, marking a brothel of no particular fame or quality. The doorman, a scarred ex-gladiator with a nose flattened from years of combat, eyed me but said nothing. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me. Cheap perfume mingled with the sour tang of wine left too long in the amphora. Dim oil lamps painted everything in hues of amber and shadow, masking the grime, but not the truth of where I stood. It was then that I saw her. Kneeling before a client in a corner, curtained off by little more than a hanging tapestry, her body moved with practiced rhythm. She wore the painted mask of a common street woman, rouged cheeks, kohl-lined eyes, hair perfumed and loosened in a way no patrician lady would dare in daylight. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I caught the curve of her cheek, the pale, flawless skin, the unmistakable gleam of golden hair spilling over her shoulders. My breath caught. It couldn't be. The man groaned in satisfaction, oblivious to the shock that had frozen me where I stood. She glanced sideways, perhaps sensing my stare. For the briefest heartbeat, her eyes met mine. Recognition flared, not on her face, but in my gut. The blood drained from my body. I knew her. Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudius, the most powerful woman in the empire. And here she was, servicing a stranger for the price of a night's drink. I wanted to believe it was some cruel trick of resemblance, that my mind, distracted by the sin-soaked air, was playing games. But no other woman bore that same combination of aristocratic grace and feline hunger in her gaze. I had seen her before, in the marble splendor of the Palatine, seated beside the emperor in her violet-dyed stola, the embodiment of Roman dignity. And now she knelt in this foul den, voluntarily wearing the shame of the lowest class of woman in the city. This was no tragic story of an empress forced into degradation. This was choice, deliberate, unflinching. She was here not out of desperation, but for something far darker. For the thrill of sinking lower than anyone could imagine, for the intoxicating anonymity of being just another body in Rome's flesh market. In that moment, I understood why whispers about Roman decadence always seemed like pale shadows of the truth. What Messalina was doing here made even the tales of Caligula's madness sound like the antics of a spoiled child. This was beyond lust. It was competition, obsession, an urge to prove herself queen not of the palace, but of the gutter. And yet, she did not simply vanish into the city's darkness. I would learn later that she did this often, slipping past her guards, trading the silks of the court for rough-spun tunics, and offering herself to the city's lowest men as if each encounter were an Olympic contest. She was, in her own mind, undefeated. The night I saw her, I left without a word. I did not tell the guards. I did not go to the emperor. I walked back through the city streets as though chased by the Erinyes themselves, unable to reconcile the woman I had just seen with the one who sat at Rome's highest seat of power. But even as I tried to bury the memory, one truth rooted itself deep. What I had witnessed was only the surface of something far darker. What would follow would not merely disgrace an empress, it would drag the entire imperial court into a pit of shame, manipulation, and fear. This night in the Subura was the first glimpse of the abyss into which Messalina would pull Rome itself.
The year was 38 CE, and to the Roman people, the imperial wedding between Claudius and Valeria Messalina was a vision of perfection. The city streets bloomed with garlands of laurel and roses. Incense curled into the air from braziers lining the forum, and heralds proclaimed the union as a blessing from the gods themselves. Messalina was only 15, barely a woman by modern reckoning, but in Rome's eyes, she was everything an empress should be: young, fertile, and descended from one of the oldest patrician families in the empire. She was a great-grand-niece of Augustus himself, a living embodiment of divine lineage, her bloodline a blend of political legitimacy and celestial prestige. To the people, she wasn't just Claudius's bride, she was the future of Rome's imperial line, a guarantee that the dynasty would endure through children born with both noble and God-kissed blood. Claudius, 13 years her senior, bore a body twisted by disability. Modern historians believe it may have been cerebral palsy, and a mind often underestimated by those around him. He walked with an uneven gait, spoke with a slight stammer, and his head sometimes jerked involuntarily. Yet under that awkward exterior was a scholar with a razor-sharp understanding of law and governance. For him, securing Messalina's hand was not just a personal triumph, it was a masterstroke of political stability. She would give him heirs, solidify his legitimacy, and grace the imperial court with her youth and beauty. Contemporary accounts painted her as the archetype of Roman beauty, pale skin that caught the light like polished marble, golden hair braided in the style of Venus, and features so perfectly proportioned they could have been carved by Phidias himself. Poets described her as a living statue of the goddess Fortuna, a symbol of prosperity and fecundity. In public, she fulfilled her role flawlessly, attending religious rites with serene dignity, hosting banquets for foreign dignitaries with practiced charm, and walking beside Claudius with the posture of a woman bred for the throne. Roman society divided women into strict categories. At the pinnacle stood the matrona, the virtuous wife and mother who upheld the family's honor. Beneath her were respectable widows, then common freeborn women. At the bottom of the hierarchy were entertainers, actresses, and prostitutes, women whose bodies were considered public property. An empress was meant to be the living embodiment of the matrona ideal, a model for the city's women, untouchable by scandal or even suspicion. The stakes were more than personal. A hint of impropriety from the empress could ignite political instability. In Rome, morality was woven into the legitimacy of rule. If the emperor's household was corrupt, then, in the eyes of the people and the Senate, the empire itself was corrupt. Thus, Messalina's position was not simply ornamental, it was foundational to Rome's political architecture. For a time, she played the part flawlessly. She bore Claudius 2 children, Britannicus, the longed-for male heir, and Claudia Octosia, a daughter destined for a dynastic marriage. In the eyes of the public, she was the perfect imperial mother. Her presence at the emperor's side sent a message of stability to allies and rivals alike. But even then, behind the polished facade, cracks were forming. Perhaps it was the suffocating routine of palace life, where every smile, every word, every step was weighed for political meaning. Perhaps it was the intoxicating knowledge that she could bend Rome's most powerful men to her will with a glance. Or perhaps it was something far deeper, a hunger for power and sensation that could never be sated by the safe pleasures of the court. Whatever its source, that hunger was already stirring. The marble walls of the Palatine Palace were beginning to feel like the bars of a gilded cage, and Messalina, the girl who had been crowned empress before her 16th birthday, was already dreaming of slipping the guards, vanishing into the city, and tasting the forbidden world that lay beyond the palace gates. The Romans saw a goddess. Messalina saw a stage, and soon she would write a performance so scandalous that history would never forget her name.
In the bright light of day, Messalina was the perfect empress. She walked the polished corridors of the Palatine Palace with the calm grace of a woman born to rule, pausing to receive petitions, bless offerings to the household gods, or offer a polite word to visiting dignitaries. To the senators and foreign envoys, she was a vision of disciplined Roman womanhood. Draped in silk stolas of imperial purple, her hair coiled high in intricate braids, her expression serene and untouchable. But night in Rome is not the same city as day, and when darkness settled over the 7 hills, something within Messalina stirred. Behind the ceremonial smile, the carefully practiced gestures, there was a restlessness, a current of energy that no banquet or courtly entertainment could exhaust. At first, her shifts in behavior were subtle. Servants began to notice that she dismissed her personal guards earlier than usual, claiming she felt fatigued and needed privacy. But moments later, she would reappear, dressed not in the embroidered silks of an empress, but in rough-spun tunics that concealed her figure and face. A plain hood, a simple belt, sandals scuffed from walking, no trace of the imperial majesty remained. Messalina's earliest nocturnal excursions might have seemed harmless, at least to the few who suspected them. Rome was vast, alive at all hours, and not all who wandered its streets were seeking vice. But the Empress's wanderings were not idle strolls. She was watching, studying, learning the ways of a city that most of her class only glimpsed from litters carried above the muck. She paid especial attention to the women who worked the streets and taverns, their gestures, their manner of speech, the way they beckoned clients or negotiated prices. She noted where the wealthier merchants preferred to drink, where the sailors sought quick company, and where the most hardened veterans went when they wanted to forget the battlefield. She learned the territory boundaries between Rome's working women, the secret signs that indicated a house of pleasure, and even the slang of the city's underclass. This was not the idle curiosity of a sheltered aristocrat. It was the deliberate gathering of intelligence, the way a general might survey an enemy's camp before battle. Her excursions became more frequent, her disguises more convincing. The thrill was no longer in slipping past her guards. It was in the knowledge that she could vanish into the crowd without a single head turning her way. At court, she continued to play her role to perfection. She presided over banquets with a warm smile, received senators' wives with dignified courtesy, and listened to Claudius's speeches as though her mind were entirely devoted to the affairs of state. But every evening, as the palace lamps were extinguished and the city's night fires began to glow, she felt the pull again, the intoxicating lure of the forbidden world that lay just beyond the palace gates. It was a dangerous game. In a society where an empress was expected to embody unassailable virtue, even the rumor of such wanderings could ignite political scandal. Yet Messalina was no fool. She understood that the greater the risk, the greater the thrill. And so she kept pushing the boundaries, testing how far she could go without detection. Soon, her curiosity would find a perfect opportunity, a festival when the city turned its own rules upside down, when the usual order dissolved, and even the highest-born could slip into the skin of someone else. And for Messalina, it would be the first step into a descent so deep that the world would still be talking about it 2,000 years later.
The chance came during Saturnalia, the most raucous and topsy-turvy festival of the Roman year. For 7 days each December, the city surrendered to chaos. Social roles reversed. Slaves dined as masters. Masters served their slaves. Gambling was legal, and drunkenness was not just tolerated, but expected. The streets swelled with masked revelers, bawdy songs, and open displays of indulgence. Even the Senate took a holiday from dignity. For most aristocrats, Saturnalia was an excuse for private banquets and harmless mischief. But for Messalina, it was an open door. Amid the masks, the noise, and the intoxicating suspension of Roman decorum, she could slip away without notice, vanish into the human tide, and taste life without the weight of her title. In the winter of 40 CE, she did exactly that. While Claudius attended the formal rites and oversaw the grand state banquet, Messalina disguised herself in the plain wool garments of a modest merchant's wife. She left the Palatine under the pretense of visiting a temple. Her true destination was the Subura district, the same place I would see her years later, Rome's heart of illicit pleasure. That night, she did more than simply watch. She entered one of the district's lesser-known brothels, a dim, low-ceilinged building with curtained alcoves and the sour, sweet smell of perfume and sweat. The madam, accustomed to occasional noblewomen seeking masked adventure, thought nothing strange of her arrival. Messalina's intention, however, was far more dangerous than the idle curiosity of a bored aristocrat. She approached the brothel keeper and made an outrageous offer. She would work for the night, anonymously, among the other women. No name, no title, just another body for sale. At first, the madam hesitated. The young woman before her was no ordinary beauty. There was a refinement to her speech, a posture that even plain clothes could not disguise. But coin was coin, and the madam had seen stranger requests during Saturnalia. The arrangement was made. What followed was whispered about in dark corners of the city for years afterwards. Messalina did not merely perform her role, she embraced it with an intensity that startled even seasoned prostitutes. She took on client after client, her stamina seemingly inexhaustible. By midnight, she had already surpassed the evening's busiest workers. By dawn, she had outlasted them all. The others stopped. She did not. Even when the lamps burned low and the brothel keeper urged her to rest, she demanded more men, more proof that she could surpass any professional. Finally, with no more clients to send her, the madam sent her away, shaking her head in disbelief. Messalina returned to the palace before the first light touched the rooftops of the city. She bathed, dressed, and took her seat beside Claudius as if nothing had happened, her face serene, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The Empress, who had just competed in an endurance contest of flesh, now played the part of Rome's virtuous mother. That night changed her. It was not merely the physical act, it was the intoxicating contrast between the grandeur of the court and the squalor of the Subura, between her marble palace and a sweat-stained cot. She had proven to herself that she could dominate not only Rome's political stage, but also its lowest and most brutal arena, the sex trade. From that moment, what had begun as a forbidden thrill became something else, a challenge, a competition, a hunger for victory measured in the exhaustion of her rivals. And for Messalina, the first taste of victory would never be enough.
The Subura district had seen noble women in disguise before, restless patrician wives slipping away to taste forbidden pleasures before hurrying home to the safety of their marble villas. But none had done what Messalina did next. Her Saturnalia escapade should have been a fleeting indulgence, a secret so dangerous that even she would think twice before repeating it. Yet instead of fear, she carried away a sense of triumph. She had not merely mingled with the city's working women, she had beaten them at their own craft. That night became a private legend she carried within herself, a memory she could summon in moments of boredom at court, a secret proof of her superiority over every woman in Rome. Over the following months, Messalina began venturing out more often, each time perfecting her disguise. Gone was the posture of the Empress, in its place a slight hunch, a shuffling step, the easy laughter of a streetwise woman. Her jewelry disappeared, replaced with cheap bronze trinkets. She learned to smear her face with coarsely applied rouge and cull, not to beautify, but to mask the natural elegance of her features. Even her voice changed. She picked up the slang of the taverns, learned to bargain over prices as if every coin mattered. The brothel she first chose was no accident. Small and tucked into a crooked side alley, it catered to a mix of sailors, freedmen, and laborers, men who asked no questions as long as the price was fair. It was a place where her identity was safe, where the idea that the woman before them might be the Empress of Rome was so absurd it could never be believed. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the mingled smells of lamp oil, cheap perfume, and bodies pressed too close together. Curtains swayed between doorways, offering the illusion of privacy without truly hiding anything. The laughter of the patrons mixed with the soft moans and whispered negotiations of the women. In the corner, an old lyre player plucked a lazy tune, adding to the haze of pleasure and fatigue that filled the room. Messalina thrived in this world. She did not work for the coin. She never took a denarius from her clients, but for the challenge. She measured her worth not by beauty, which she had in abundance, but by endurance.
The professionals soon noticed that this new street woman could take on more clients in a night than anyone in the house, and she did it without ever seeming worn down. She learned the tricks of the trade quickly, how to charm without appearing desperate, how to pace herself for a long night, how to keep men coming back for more. In a profession where survival meant knowing when to stop, she pushed herself to the limits as though proving that no mortal woman could outlast her. But this was no simple thrill-seeking. Deep down, Messalina was testing the boundaries of power itself. An empress was meant to rule through dignity, distance, and untouchable virtue. By stripping all that away, by lowering herself to the very bottom of Rome's social order and excelling there, she was inverting the rules. Here, in the sweat and shadows of the Sabura, she was not the emperor's wife. She was the undisputed champion of an arena few dared to enter. It was dangerous, reckless, and intoxicating. And soon, a single night in the Sabura would no longer be enough. She began to think bigger, not of random visits, but of contests, challenges, and audiences who would watch the Empress prove herself in the most degrading way imaginable. For Messalina, the brothel debut was only the beginning.
What began as a single night of masked indulgence soon hardened into ritual. Messalina's clandestine trips were no longer spontaneous bursts of rebellion. They were planned with the precision of a military operation. Every detail was accounted for. The timing of her departure, the guards she would distract or dismiss, the route she would take through the city's back alleys, and the precise hour she would return before the palace awoke. She gathered around herself a small circle of trusted servants, slaves whose loyalty was secured not by affection, but by the knowledge that betrayal would mean their own ruin. These were her accomplices, tasked with acquiring disguises, arranging transportation, and most dangerously, keeping the secret from Claudius and the imperial household. Messalina's disguises grew more elaborate. She wore not just plain wool tunics, but patched, threadbare garments that smelled faintly of smoke, as if pulled from the racks of a second-hand market. She would smear dust into her hair to dull its golden shine, roughen her palms with ash, and carry small baskets of bread or figs to appear as though she were returning from a market errand. But beneath this humble exterior, the mind of an empress was always working. Messalina began mapping the city's sexual underworld like a general plotting a campaign. She knew which taverns funneled customers to which brothels, which street corners yielded the wealthiest patrons, and which hours of the night brought the highest traffic. She studied the techniques of the most skilled courtesans, how they controlled the pace of an encounter, how they whispered into a client's ear to inspire loyalty, how they transformed desire into dependency. Her goal was no longer simply to participate, it was to dominate. She started issuing informal challenges to the women she met. Who could take the most clients in a single night? Who could keep going when exhaustion claimed the others? She bet on herself every time, and every time she won. The thrill was not merely sexual. For Messalina, it was a form of conquest. In the Senate, her voice was silenced by custom. In the palace, she had to work through whispers and influence. But here, in the brothel, her supremacy was unquestioned and absolute.
She could outlast, outmaneuver, and outshine every rival without the constraints of law or propriety. It was during this period that her name, though never spoken openly, began to circulate in certain hidden circles of the city. Men whispered about a mysterious woman, neither slave nor courtesan, whose appetite was unmatched. The brothel keepers knew better to press her for her identity, but they welcomed her, for wherever she appeared, customers followed. Her nocturnal life became a second empire, one hidden in shadows, built not on decrees and legions, but on whispered dares and the heavy breathing of those who had just met her challenge and failed. She ruled it as ruthlessly as any emperor ruled his provinces. And then, in 41 CE, Messalina would take her obsession to its next level. No more whispered challenges in back rooms. This time, her contest would be public, an event so notorious that even the most jaded Romans would struggle to believe it truly happened.
The year was 41 CE, and the rumor spread through Rome's backstreets like spilled wine racing between the cobblestones. The mysterious woman who had been haunting the Suburra's brothels had issued an open challenge to Scylla, the most celebrated prostitute in the city. Scylla was no ordinary courtesan. She was a legend among Rome's elite, famed for her beauty, her wit, and most of all, her stamina. Senators, generals, and foreign envoys alike had paid fortunes for a night with her, and she had never once been bested in her profession's most brutal contest, the endurance match. The rules were simple. From sunset to dawn, each woman would take as many clients as possible. At first glance, it was a test of the flesh, but in truth, it was a contest of discipline, skill, and cunning. The winner was crowned not only the queen of Rome's carnal world, but the undisputed standard by which all others would be measured. When the challenge was announced, word spread quickly through the underworld and into the ears of the city's wealthiest thrill-seekers. The location was chosen, a large, lavishly appointed establishment in the heart of the Suburra, one that could host an audience as well as accommodate the competition itself. The owner, recognizing the fortune to be made from such an event, prepared it like an arena for gladiators, with wine flowing freely and betting pools established in the back rooms. The audience that gathered was unlike anything seen before. Wealthy merchants and gamblers rubbed shoulders with drunken soldiers. The shadows at the back of the room hid cloaked aristocrats who had slipped away from the marble halls of power to see the spectacle for themselves. Coins clinked in anticipation, wagers were shouted across the hall, and the smell of sweat and perfume mingled into a heady haze. Scylla arrived first, dressed in a silken wrap the color of deep wine, her hair pinned with gold. She carried herself with the easy confidence of a champion defending her crown. When the challenger entered, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Messalina's disguise was perfect. Plain robes, loosened hair, no trace of imperial regality. Only her eyes betrayed something deeper, the focused, almost predatory gleam of a woman who had come not to entertain, but to conquer. The contest began at the toll of the evening bell. Scylla moved with the precision of a veteran, pacing herself, alternating between wealthy patrons who demanded longer attention and quick transactions that would keep her numbers high. Messalina, by contrast, dove into the fray with relentless energy, her movements sharp and efficient, her laughter carrying above the din as she dismissed one man only to beckon the next. As the night deepened, the crowd's excitement turned to awe. Scylla, though steady, began to slow. Her years of experience had taught her to conserve her strength, but the unspoken truth was undeniable. She was tiring. By the time she had serviced her 25th client, she was pale, her limbs heavy, and she quietly admitted defeat. She had never lost before. But Messalina was not done. With Scylla's concession, the competition was technically over, yet the Empress refused to stop. She called for more men, drawing volunteers from the audience itself. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, her pace unbroken. When no more clients could be found, the room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of Messalina's steady breathing. The count stood at over 30 men in a single night. For those present, the victory was not celebrated. It was unsettling. They had seen not just physical endurance, but an appetite that defied understanding, a hunger that was less about pleasure and more about domination. In the days that followed, whispers spread beyond the Suburra. A few in the Senate heard of the contest, though they dismissed it as a vulgar fiction. But those who had been there knew the truth. The challenger had not been an ordinary woman. She was something else entirely. Something dangerous. And for Messalina, the taste of such a public, undisputed victory was like pouring oil onto a fire already burning out of control.
The morning after the endurance contest, the Suburra still buzzed with the residue of disbelief. Brothel keepers, street vendors, and drunken patrons who had staggered home at dawn told and retold the tale of the mysterious woman who had humbled Scylla, the queen of Rome's pleasure houses. Some recounted it with awe, others with a hint of fear, as though speaking her name too loudly might summon her back into their doorways. But the ripples did not stop in the Suburra. Like all dangerous gossip in Rome, the story traveled upward through servants, household slaves, and the lower ranks of imperial staff, until it reached ears that should never have heard it. Cloaked aristocrats who had witnessed the event firsthand were careful not to name her, yet their descriptions painted an unmistakable portrait for anyone who had seen the Empress in her public life. Pale skin, golden hair, a face that could pass for marble sculpture. To the common people, it was just another sordid tale in a city accustomed to excess. But in the Senate, the implications were far more serious. The wife of the emperor was not merely rumored to be unfaithful. If these whispers were true, she was degrading the dignity of the imperial household itself. Roman morality was not simply a private matter, it was a political currency. An emperor's legitimacy rested partly on the virtue of his household, and a scandal on this scale could be used by enemies as a weapon to undermine his rule. If the empress could be seen in such a state, anonymous, servicing strangers for sport, what did that say about the authority of the man who shared her bed? Yet the Senate did not move against her. They couldn't. First, because there was no public proof, only whispers passed between lips in shadowed corners. And second, because Messalina had already mastered the oldest defense in Roman politics: fear.
Her charm, her intelligence, and her growing influence at court had made her dangerous to cross. Even before her darkest schemes, she had a knack for turning rivals into outcasts, for ensuring those who displeased her found themselves stripped of office or dragged into legal ruin. Still, the contest had changed something. She was no longer just an empress with a taste for adventure. She was an active, destabilizing force, a threat to the image of Roman rule itself. And for Messalina, the night was intoxicating, not just for the thrill of victory, but for the realization that she could act with such audacity and walk back into the palace untouched. Those who knew the whispers began watching her differently. At banquets, senators studied her smile, wondering what secrets lay behind it. At religious ceremonies, matrons glanced away, unwilling to meet her gaze for too long. The distance between the imperial image and the hidden truth had grown wider, more dangerous, and far harder to control. And yet, instead of retreating, Messalina seemed emboldened. The contest had shown her that the greater the scandal, the more exhilarating the power. In her mind, the Suburra was no longer a place of escape. It was a stage, and the empire itself was an audience she intended to keep both enthralled and terrified. What she began planning next would move her from a figure of rumor to the architect of one of the most audacious criminal enterprises Rome had ever known.
By 42 CE, Messalina's nightly escapades had shifted from reckless indulgence to calculated enterprise. She had tasted the thrill of defiance, the intoxication of humiliating rivals, and the secret satisfaction of moving through the city like a shadow. But now she began to see her pursuits in colder, sharper terms. Lust was still part of the game, but it was no longer the primary objective. The true prize was power. Power gathered not through armies or decrees, but through secrets, shame, and the slow tightening of invisible chains around Rome's most influential men and women. The plan she devised was audacious even by the standards of an empire accustomed to vice at the highest levels. If she could disguise herself as a common street woman and win contests against the Suburra's finest, she could also build an institution, a sanctuary for the powerful to indulge their darkest desires without fear of exposure. Or so they would think. She chose her location carefully, a luxurious villa near the Campus Martius, just far enough from the Palatine to avoid suspicion, yet close enough for discreet visits by the city's elite. On its surface, it was simply another private club for Rome's wealthiest citizens, a place to dine, gamble, and drink fine wine. But behind its marble facade lay a far more dangerous truth. This was Messalina's creation, a high-end brothel unlike any in Rome. Its workers were not the typical street women nor freed slaves, but noble-born women, aristocrats coerced into service under the threat of financial ruin, political disgrace, or worse. Many were the wives or daughters of senators and military officers, women whose presence in such a place would destroy their families if the truth were revealed. Messalina's recruitment was ruthless. She approached her targets subtly, often at banquets or public gatherings, dangling favors or protection in exchange for cooperation. When charm failed, she resorted to veiled threats, hinting at debts she could expose, scandals she could invent, or imperial displeasure she could summon with a word. Few dared resist. Her clientele was equally selective. Senators, high-ranking military commanders, influential merchants, men whose positions gave them access to information worth more than gold. Messalina's genius lay in understanding that every pleasure could be turned into a liability. Every whispered confession in the heat of passion, every careless boast after too much wine was catalogued and preserved. The villa's staff, hand-picked servants loyal to her alone, were trained to listen, to remember, to report. Behind hidden panels, scribes recorded names, conversations, and details that could be used for blackmail. Every night was both a performance and a trap, a web in which the city's most powerful figures willingly entangled themselves. What began as scandal now had the structure of a criminal empire. Messalina was no longer simply the empress with a secret life. She was Rome's most dangerous madam, her influence stretching beyond the palace into the heart of the Senate and the military. And because her victims' shame was the very thing that kept them silent, her position seemed untouchable. But for Messalina, secrecy was never enough. The thrill was not only in control, but in the spectacle of it all.
Messalina's new enterprise thrived in the shadows, but it was no passive venture. Every night she turned desire into leverage, weaving a net so intricate that few of its captives even realized how tightly they were bound until escape was impossible. She had transformed the brothel from a place of fleeting pleasure into an engine of political control. Her methods were both simple and devastating. When a prominent man visited the villa, he was greeted with all the comforts of an elite social club: warm light from silver lamps, marble floors strewn with fine rugs, amphorae of vintage Falernian wine. He would be ushered into conversation by other influential guests, lulled into a false sense of camaraderie. Then the true entertainment would begin. The women in Messalina's service were not anonymous shadows. They were the wives, sisters, and daughters of Rome's ruling class, though their identities were concealed until the moment of compromise. By the time a man discovered the truth that the woman he had just bedded was the spouse of a political ally, or worse, the relative of a rival, it was too late. His honor, and often hers, was already destroyed. Messalina's spies were everywhere. Hidden behind decorative screens, servants quietly recorded whispered confessions about Senate votes, military campaigns, and personal ambitions. Any scrap of information that could be turned to her advantage was preserved, and she used it all. A senator who spoke too freely about opposing imperial policy might find himself summoned to the palace, only to be reminded, delicately, that certain details about his private life would make unfortunate headlines if repeated in the forum. A merchant who boasted about evading customs taxes would suddenly discover that only Messalina's intervention could spare him from ruinous fines.
Military commanders were perhaps the most valuable. One careless remark about loyalty, and she could turn them into pawns in her own political games. What made her power so dangerous was that it did not rely on formal authority. Claudius, distracted by governance and the trappings of office, remained unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to the extent of his wife's nocturnal activities. To him, she was still the attentive empress, the mother of his children. To the rest of Rome's elite, she was an unspoken force they could not afford to provoke. The brothel became more than a place of indulgence. It was a court within the court, a parallel seat of power where Messalina ruled without the constraints of the Senate or the emperor's advisers. Decisions in the forum began to shift subtly in her favor. Grain shipments were redirected, tax disputes resolved in ways that benefited her allies, military appointments granted to men she knew she could control. And yet it was not enough. For Messalina, secrecy had always been part of the thrill, but so too was the performance. To watch Rome's most powerful men and women humiliate themselves in public under the guise of duty, that would be the ultimate conquest. Her mind began to turn toward an even bolder idea. Gatherings so grand, so brazen, that the line between religious ceremony and orchestrated debauchery would blur beyond recognition. In these spectacles, no one would be safe. Not senators, not their wives, not even the next generation of Rome's nobility. The stage was set for the Empress to turn her private web of blackmail into a public theater of humiliation.
By now, Messalina's brothel was no longer just a place where the elite came to indulge themselves. It had become the center of an invisible empire, one that stretched into the very heart of Rome's political machine. Every curtain that fell behind a departing client concealed a transaction far more binding than the exchange of coin for flesh. It was an unspoken contract, signed in whispers and sealed with shame. Her records were meticulous. Hidden and locked chests, guarded by slaves whose loyalty was ensured by their own complicity, were scrolls containing the names of senators, tribunes, merchants, and military commanders. Each name was accompanied by detailed notes, who they slept with, what they revealed in moments of carelessness, what vices could be exploited if they ever turned against her. For a Roman man of power, honor was everything. A single accusation of adultery, especially with the wife of a fellow noble, could destroy a political career overnight. Messalina understood this, and she weaponized it with surgical precision. She didn't always have to make threats. Most of the time, the mere knowledge that she knew was enough to ensure obedience. She also knew how to apply pressure indirectly. If a senator began speaking too freely against imperial policy, a friendly reminder might arrive in the form of a rumor whispered in the marketplace, or a story conveniently leaked to a rival. The victim, realizing how close they had come to public ruin, would fall silent, and often suddenly become a supporter of whatever policy Messalina favored. Her reach extended into the domestic spheres of her targets. A man who thought he was safe might find his wife or daughter summoned to assist at a private gathering where the lines between entertainment and coercion were deliberately blurred. Once compromised, these women became pawns as well, unwilling to betray the empress for fear of their own reputations. This web was not only effective, it was self-sustaining. Those caught in it often became agents of her will, whether they realized it or not. Senators persuaded other senators to cooperate with the empress. Merchants recommended fellow traders for discreet business opportunities at the villa. Military officers quietly directed their subordinates to ensure Messalina's requests were met without question. And because the shame was so profound, there was no open resistance. No one dared to bring formal charges or even speak her name in the context of scandal. To accuse her would be to expose oneself, and in Rome the court of public opinion was merciless. It was a masterpiece of psychological control. Messalina had created a system in which her victims became her protectors, their silence the very shield that allowed her to operate in plain sight. But for a woman who had once prowled the Sabura for the thrill of defying her station, this hidden dominion, powerful though it was, had its limits. It was still secret. And secrecy, as she had learned, was not nearly as exhilarating as spectacle. She began to imagine something more brazen, public events where the humiliation was not whispered about in backrooms but displayed under the guise of religious and civic duty. The shame would be shared so widely, so deeply, that her power would no longer rest on individual secrets. It would rest on the collective silence of an entire ruling class.
By 44 CE, Messalina's thirst for control had outgrown the shadowy confines of her private villa. The secrecy of her brothel was effective, but it lacked the intoxicating rush that came from watching her victims squirm in full view of their peers. She wanted not only to own their secrets, but to display her dominance in a theater so vast that all of Rome's elite would be trapped in the same snare. Her solution was as audacious as it was grotesque. She would turn public religious festivals into carefully choreographed spectacles of degradation. To the Senate and the people, they would appear as pious celebrations, rites honoring the gods and reinforcing the unity of Rome's ruling class. But behind the incense and formal prayers lay an altogether different purpose. The gatherings began innocently enough. Invitations were sent to senators, their wives, and their children, summoning them to exclusive ceremonies in honor of various deities. Attendance was framed as a civic duty, an act of devotion to the state and the gods themselves. No one could refuse without drawing suspicion. The events would open with traditional rituals, libations poured before the altars, oaths recited in solemn tones, processions winding through marble courtyards lit with torches. But as the evening deepened, the ceremonies would subtly shift. The music grew slower, more suggestive. The wine flowed more freely. The sacred dances performed by priestesses became more intimate and revealing. Messalina, ever the conductor of this symphony of corruption, would introduce elements she claimed were authentic revivals of ancient rites, obscure, half-forgotten customs that conveniently blurred the boundaries between worship and sensuality. A touch here, a lingering kiss there, all cloaked in the language of piety. By the time the truth of what was happening began to dawn on the participants, it was already too late. The transformation from sacred festival to orchestrated orgy was gradual but inescapable. Senators found themselves drawn into acts they would never have dared in public. Their wives, compelled by the presence of the Empress herself, played their parts under the gaze of an audience that included friends, rivals, and political allies. Messalina's genius lay not only in the acts themselves, but in ensuring that everyone was equally compromised. No one could later claim moral superiority, for all had partaken. The shared shame became a chain that bound them together and to her. Some of the most chilling accounts describe her positioning herself as a spectator at these events, reclining like an emperor at the games, offering commentary and sly encouragement as couples, sometimes political enemies, were paired off for sacred unions. What began as feigned compliance would end in genuine humiliation, the victim's dignity stripped away in front of those whose respect they could never regain. And the damage extended beyond the participants themselves. Messalina began inviting the adolescent children of Rome's most prominent families under the pretense of religious authenticity, claiming that certain rites required their involvement. These youths, raised to obey imperial authority without question, became pawns in her spectacle, further entangling their parents in the web of silence. The brilliance and horror of the scheme was that no force or threat was needed. The social and political machinery of Rome ensured attendance. The fear of isolation ensured participation. And the iron weight of collective guilt ensured silence afterward. In these festivals, Messalina had found the perfect balance between performance and power. Her victims became her co-conspirators, their own complicity the strongest safeguard against rebellion. But as with every stage she had ever built, the Empress's appetite for escalation would not let her stop here. The next act would push even Rome's capacity for scandal to its breaking point.
By the time her festivals had become a regular fixture of Rome's elite calendar, Messalina's control over the ruling class was nearly absolute. But for her, dominance was never just about securing obedience. It was about breaking those who dared to oppose her, and doing it in a way that would leave them too shamed to ever rise again. She reserved her cruelest performances for political rivals, senators who had spoken against her influence in the palace, generals who had resisted her preferred appointments, even wealthy merchants who had withheld favors. None were safe from the Empress's stagecraft. Her method was chillingly effective. During these gatherings, she would single out a rival under the guise of honoring them. Before the assembled guests, she would praise their devotion to the gods and invite them to participate in a special rite. The chosen target, bound by etiquette and the presence of the Empress wife, could not refuse. The rite would begin innocuously, perhaps a simple offering or dance. But Messalina would gradually raise the stakes, pairing the target with a partner they could not afford to be seen with. The spouse of a political ally, the daughter of a respected elder, or even another political enemy. Once the act was underway, the pressure to continue became overwhelming, especially with Messalina herself watching, wine cup in hand, offering sly encouragement, and laughing softly at moments of hesitation. Senators who had once thundered against corruption in the forum now found themselves stripped of their togas, performing acts that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The wives of patrician families, whose honor was their greatest asset, were coaxed or manipulated into public displays that would forever taint their reputations. The humiliation was total. The moment the rite ended, Messalina would greet the participant with a mock-solemn kiss on the forehead, as though blessing them for their service to the gods. The message was unmistakable. She could make them do anything, anywhere, and they would be powerless to resist. The inclusion of aristocratic youth added another layer of cruelty. Sons and daughters of the most powerful families, many barely past childhood, were drawn into her spectacles under the pretense of reviving ancient traditions. Some were paired with their elders in scenes that blurred the boundaries of propriety so completely that even Rome's famously permissive moral code seemed strained. The parents, trapped by their own participation in earlier rites, could not protest without incriminating themselves. The result was a kind of generational corruption. Those who had been coerced into these acts carried the trauma and shame for years, shaping their loyalties and silences long after Messalina's reign ended. Foreign ambassadors, invited as honored guests to these sacred celebrations, began sending back alarming reports to their homelands. They noted the strange, submissive behavior of Rome's senators during negotiations, the distracted, almost fearful tone of military leaders. It was as though the entire ruling class had been broken, not by war or assassination, but by the calculated use of shame as a weapon. Messalina had discovered something no general, no dictator, no emperor had mastered so completely, that the fear of public humiliation could hold a man more tightly than chains, and silence a crowd more effectively than an executioner's sword. But as she tightened her grip on the elite, she also began to believe she was untouchable. It was this belief that would drive her to commit the most audacious act of her life, one that would finally push Rome past the point of silent submission.
By the mid-40s CE, the effects of Messalina's reign of manipulation were etched into the daily life of Rome's leadership. In the Senate, debates grew strangely muted, with few daring to speak forcefully against any policy that bore even a hint of the Empress's approval. Those who once stood as fiery orators now weighed every word as if their careers and perhaps their lives hung in the balance. The military showed similar signs of unease. Legions that had once boasted commanders known for their independence now answered to officers whose appointments owed less to merit than to Messalina's whispered endorsements. Soldiers grumbled quietly in taverns about orders that seemed politically motivated, while their generals avoided eye contact when questioned about imperial strategy. Foreign ambassadors began sending back reports that puzzled their home courts.
In official meetings, Rome's envoys were hesitant, distracted, and unusually eager to avoid confrontation. Agreements were signed that made little sense from a purely strategic standpoint. Grain shipments redirected to allies with no real influence. Trade deals weighted heavily in favor of obscure merchants. Military treaties sealed with parties who had little to offer in return. The truth, invisible to the public, was that many of these arrangements were the direct result of Messalina's control. Those who owed her favors or feared her knowledge of their secrets acted in ways that defied logic but preserved their own safety. A senator compromised in one of her brothel's back rooms would support her chosen candidate for provincial governor without question. A merchant who had been entertained in the villa's hidden chambers would suddenly find himself winning lucrative state contracts. Within the palace, an air of quiet tension hung over the servants and attendants. They knew which corridors to avoid at certain hours, which rooms were forbidden except to a select few, and which guests to bow to without asking their names. Messalina moved through these halls with the easy confidence of someone who knew that no one would challenge her, not even Claudius. Whether the emperor truly remained ignorant of her activities or simply chose to look away is still debated by historians. Some believe his trust in her was genuine, others that he feared the chaos her public disgrace might unleash. For all the people of Rome, the empress remained a distant figure, her scandals only hinted at in carefully censored whispers. Officially, she was still the model of Roman womanhood, a mother of imperial heirs, a patroness of public works, a presence at state ceremonies. But beneath that polished facade, the city's political machinery was being quietly re-engineered to serve her will. Rome was, in effect, under two rulers. One wore the laurel crown and commanded the legions. The other wore the guise of the dutiful wife, but ruled through a web of shame, lust, and unbreakable silence. Yet for all her mastery, Messalina was restless. Control in the shadows was not enough. She had humiliated rivals, bent senators to her will, and corrupted the next generation of Rome's elite. Now she wanted something more dangerous, something that would shatter the thin line between her private power and Rome's public order. The opportunity would come in 48 CE, when the emperor left the city on official business, and in his absence, Messalina would stage an act so outrageous that even the most scandal-hardened Romans would struggle to comprehend it.
In the autumn of 48 CE, Emperor Claudius departed for Ostia to oversee the grain shipments that fed the capital. It was a routine trip, a matter of logistics, and one the Empress was expected to watch over the palace in his absence. But Messalina saw his absence as more than an opportunity. It was the moment she had been waiting for. For months she had been pursuing Gaius Silius, a strikingly handsome young senator whose political ambitions were matched only by his good looks. At first, Silius had welcomed her attention. To be favored by the Empress was no small advantage. But as her desire for him deepened, her demands grew more dangerous. This was not to be a discreet affair. Messalina wanted to replace Claudius, not in secret, but in full view of Rome. Her plan was staggering in its audacity. She would marry Silius legally and publicly, while still the emperor's wife. In Roman law, such an act was not merely scandalous, it was treason. Marriage was a binding contract, and to wed another man while Claudius still lived was to declare that the emperor's authority and his marriage meant nothing. The ceremony was arranged with dizzying speed. Messalina summoned her most loyal allies, many of them already bound to her through years of blackmail, coercion, or shared guilt from her festivals and brothel intrigues. Invitations went out under the guise of a private celebration, but by the time guests arrived, this was no mere party, it was a wedding feast. The event was conducted with all the formalities of Roman tradition. Priests were present to offer the required sacrifices, auspices were taken to ensure the gods' favor, and witnesses signed contracts recognizing the union. Messalina and Silius exchanged vows in the sight of Rome's most prominent citizens, as if Claudius were already dead or irrelevant. And then the celebration began in earnest. What followed was not the restrained dignity of a patrician wedding, but a multi-day orgy that outstripped even the wildest of her previous spectacles. Wine flowed in endless streams, music thundered from lyres and flutes, and the guests, many already compromised by her past schemes, participated in displays of excess that blurred the line between celebration and deliberate debasement. Messalina reveled in it, parading herself beside Silius as though he were already emperor. She referred to herself openly as his wife, and in private moments, according to later accounts, spoke of him as Rome's rightful ruler. Some guests, trapped in the web of her influence, applauded and toasted the new union. Others stood frozen, aware that what they were witnessing was not just a scandal, but an open act of rebellion. For Silius, the triumph was hollow. Whether he realized it during the feast or only in the days that followed, he was trapped. To reject Messalina now would be to incur her wrath, and with it the destruction she could so easily unleash. To remain with her was to risk the emperor's vengeance, which, if it came, would be swift and merciless. But Messalina was beyond such caution. In her mind, she had already claimed a new throne, and the shame-bound Senate, the corrupted military, and the complicit nobility would fall in line as they always had. She had spent years teaching them to obey her will. Why would this be any different? What she failed to see was that this time she had not just challenged individuals, she had challenged the very authority of the emperor himself. And when Claudius learned of the betrayal, there would be no shadows to hide in, no festival to mask the truth.
In the delirium of her so-called marriage, Messalina seemed to slip into an alternate reality where her desires alone could reshape Rome. To her mind, she and Gaius Silius were already emperor and empress. The vows spoken, the witnesses present, the contract sealed. These were not mere symbols, but the foundation of a new imperial order. She began acting accordingly. Orders were issued in Silius's name. Imperial messengers carried her decrees to officials across the city. She summoned allies to the villa as though it were now the seat of power, receiving them in her finest robes, with Silius seated beside her on a raised dais. Claudius, far away in Ostia, was spoken of not as the ruler of Rome, but as a relic of a fading past, a man she had already erased in all but name. For the first time in years, Messalina seemed to believe she no longer needed secrecy, coercion, or the careful dance of blackmail. The loyalty of her compromised victims had convinced her they would follow her openly. Senators who had once been forced into silence, merchants indebted to her protection, generals bound to her by private shame. Surely they would stand with her now, if only to preserve their own necks. But the truth was more fragile than she realized. Many of these men and women had complied in secret because exposure would ruin them. Publicly supporting an act as treasonous as marrying another man while the emperor still lived was something else entirely. In private, whispers began to grow, hesitant at first, then sharper, tinged with fear, not of Messalina, but of what would happen when Claudius returned. Silius, for all his youth and ambition, saw the danger more clearly. What had begun as an intoxicating affair with the most powerful woman in the empire had transformed into a nightmare. Messalina's fantasy was pulling him toward inevitable destruction. He tried to persuade her to act cautiously, to perhaps quietly annul the marriage before word spread too far, but she would not hear of it. She was convinced that Claudius would never dare move against her. Hadn't she humiliated senators, generals, and aristocrats for years without consequence? Hadn't her will become law in everything that mattered? Her arrogance blinded her to the difference between private control and public defiance. Behind closed doors, Silius began to plan for escape. Perhaps he could plead ignorance, claim he had been seduced and coerced by the Empress. Perhaps he could disappear into one of his provincial estates before Claudius returned. But in truth, it was already too late. The witnesses to the wedding were too many, the gossip spreading too fast. Meanwhile, loyal freedmen of Claudius, men who had served him for years and recognized the danger, were already racing to Ostia with the news. The emperor's first reaction was disbelief. Messalina's past excesses had been whispered about before, but bigamy in the open with a sitting senator? It seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The freedmen carried not only reports from eyewitnesses, but signed marriage contracts, proof of the religious rites performed, and testimony from senators who, though compromised, were unwilling to risk being implicated in open rebellion. For the first time, Claudius understood the full scale of the threat, not just to his marriage, but to the stability of his rule. Messalina was no longer playing her dangerous games in the shadows. She had stepped into the daylight, and in doing so, had declared war on the emperor himself.
Claudius did not linger in Ostia. Once the freedmen had laid the evidence before him, marriage contracts, priestly attestations, and the accounts of senators who had stood as witnesses, there was no room for hesitation. What Messalina had done was not merely betrayal. It was a direct challenge to his authority, an act that, if left unanswered, would brand him as weak and invite open rebellion across the empire. He gathered a contingent of loyal troops and rode hard for Rome, the sea winds at his back as he returned to confront the woman who had shared his bed and, until now, his trust. The journey was filled with grim silence. The soldiers knew this was not a matter of palace gossip, but a question of imperial survival. If the Empress could wed another man in broad daylight and still hold the city's loyalty, Claudius's reign was already lost. In the city, word of the emperor's return raced ahead of him. Those who had cheered Messalina's wedding, or at least stood by in silence, now began to slip away from her side. The guests from the multi-day orgy found pressing business elsewhere. Senators suddenly remembered their loyalty to the emperor. Even Silius, realizing the tide was turning, considered surrender as his only chance of survival. Messalina was in the gardens when Claudius arrived, lavish, sunlit spaces where she had spent countless hours weaving her intrigues. Accounts from those present describe her at first as defiant, striding toward the emperor with the confidence of a woman who had talked her way out of trouble before. But as she looked into his face, that defiance began to crack. Claudius was not confused, nor hesitant. He was resolute. The freedmen flanked him, their eyes fixed on her, their expressions cold. Some had once carried her messages, arranged her secret meetings, or shielded her from the emperor's suspicion. Now they stood as her accusers, the very people she had thought forever bound to her by loyalty or fear. Claudius spoke little. His orders were curt, his tone flat. This was not a husband confronting a wife. It was a ruler delivering judgment on a traitor. Messalina tried to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to charm him one last time, but the soldiers moved forward at a signal from the emperor. The moment was over. Silius, brought before Claudius in chains, did not resist. His dreams of power had evaporated, leaving only the hope of a swift death. But Messalina still seemed unable to comprehend the finality of what was happening. Even as she was led away, some accounts claim she sent messages to Claudius begging for a private meeting, convinced she could plead her way back into favor. But the emperor had made his decision. Rome could survive many scandals, but not an empress who openly replaced its ruler. There would be no trial, no public spectacle. Claudius's response would be swift, decisive, and absolute. The order went out. Valeria Messalina, once the most powerful woman in Rome, would be executed before the day was done.
Messalina's final hours were a mixture of disbelief, desperation, and the creeping realization that the web she had spun for years was unraveling around her. Claudius had not summoned her for a last audience. There would be no chance to charm him, no opportunity to weep at his feet and plead for mercy. For a woman who had built her power on persuasion, seduction, and the manipulation of human weakness, that silence was the clearest sign that her reign was over.
According to later accounts, she was taken to the gardens of Lucullus, a place she had once filled with laughter, music, and carefully staged gatherings. Now it was her prison. The soldiers assigned to her execution were not strangers. They were men who had served in the palace, who had walked those same corridors where she had ruled so absolutely. Their presence was an unspoken reminder that no one in Rome was beyond the reach of imperial justice. Even in those last moments, Messalina reportedly hesitated. Some versions suggest she tried to take her own life, fumbling with a dagger, before the executioner stepped in to finish the task. Others claim she begged for her life, clinging to the hope that Claudius might still relent. But the emperor's orders were explicit, and his freedmen, those loyal agents who had exposed her, made sure they were carried out without delay. Her death was swift. Her legacy, however, would be dismantled with deliberate cruelty. Claudius decreed damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of her memory. Her statues were torn down from the public spaces where she had once been celebrated. Her name was chiseled off inscriptions, her images destroyed, her likeness erased from coins. Officially, she ceased to exist. To speak of her became an act of treason. The empire moved quickly to bury not only her body, but the entire record of her life. Claudius remarried within months, and the new empress, Agrippina the Younger, ensured that Messalina's shadow would not linger over the court. The senators who had once feared her were only too happy to pretend she never lived, their own survival dependent on forgetting. But history has never truly forgotten her. Though the official record was purged, the whispers persisted, preserved in the writings of historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, who painted her as the embodiment of imperial depravity. To some, she was a warning of what happens when unchecked desire meets unrestrained power. To others, she was the inevitable product of a Rome that valued spectacle as much as virtue. In the end, Messalina's greatest weapon, shame, became her undoing. She had built an empire of secrets, confident that no one would dare expose her. Yet when she turned her appetite for domination into open defiance of the emperor himself, the fear that had shielded her vanished. Claudius did not need to defeat her in the shadows. He crushed her in the open, leaving her name as a cautionary tale whispered centuries afterward. Her fall marked the close of an era when scandal had nearly replaced competence in the imperial household, and it left behind a lingering question: how many other stories like hers have been buried beneath the marble of history, erased by those who could not afford to let the truth survive?